Welcome back to Faith in Question. Do you remember the story in the Bible where Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery? Well, what if I told you that that's not actually what the Bible says? I say all the time that most Christians don't read the Bible for themselves. They remember these stories from Sunday school, but it's fun to actually go back to the Bible and take a look at what they say. And a lot of times when I do this, folks are surprised at what's actually there. And when we look specifically at the story of Joseph, multiple contradictions and errors start to emerge from the Bible that a lot of people haven't ever thought about. So in less than 13 minutes today, we're going to review this story, and we'll see what the Bible says that has become so controversial that Christians have changed the Sunday school version of this story to make it easier to believe in. So let's dive into that. Okay, so we're looking at the story of Joseph today in Genesis chapter 37, and you'll remember that Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob. And the Bible says he was 17 years old when this story actually happens. Now Joseph has 10 half-brothers, and he has one younger brother who's his full-blooded brother from his mother, Rachel. His brother's name was Benjamin, and you see him later on in the book of Genesis. But during this period of time, Joseph is seemingly the youngest child, and he's his father's favorite child. You remember that he actually had a couple of dreams where his brothers and his father and mother would bow down to him someday. And his brothers already hated him for being the favorite child, but they especially hated him even more after these dreams. Even his father Jacob didn't like how he handled these dreams. But even still, he was the favorite child, and you remember that his father had made him a coat of many colors, which was the evidence that he was the favorite child amongst the 11 at that time. So we're going to pick up the story of Joseph in Genesis chapter 37, right after we find out that Joseph's brothers are sheep herders, and they're taking care of the sheep, not there locally, but they're out somewhere else, taking care of the sheep. And Joseph's father says, hey, I'm going to send you with some provisions to go visit your brothers and just make sure everything's okay. So in verse 12, we find out that they go to the land of Shechem to feed the sheep. And Jacob sends Joseph in verse 14 out of the vale of Hebron, and Joseph came to Shechem. Now verse 15, it gets a little bit weird, so I'll just read these verses. A certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, What seekest thou? Verse 16, and he said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flocks. Verse 17, and the man said, They are departed hence, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. And Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. These verses are kind of interesting to me because it's useless. It doesn't add any new value to the story. The Bible says in verse 12 they were in Shechem. Joseph goes to Shechem in verse 14, and then 15 through 17 are just him finding out they're not there, and he goes somewhere else. I don't know what this is for, but it's interesting that it made it into the book. So as we come down to verse 20, you know the story. His brothers see him coming from a far way off, and they say, you know what? We don't like Joseph. We hate him. We hate those dreams. Let's go ahead and kill him, and we can actually say that an evil beast did it, and then we'll see what comes of those dreams that he had. But in verses 21 and 22, Reuben, the oldest brother, says, hold on, guys. Let's not kill him. Let's just put him into this pit in the wilderness. And he was thinking in his mind that if he convinced them to put him into the pit, he could go back later and pull him out of the pit and save him for his father, for whatever reason that would actually be. So he's successful in convincing them. Verses 23 and 24, they take Joseph, they take his coat of many colors off, and they throw him into the pit. And the Bible says that there was no water in the pit. Again, another detail that's not really useful, but it's just something that actually is there. There was no water in the pit. Okay. Now verse 25 is where this contradiction starts to come into play and where things get really interesting. So they sit down to eat some distance away from the pit for some reason. Who knows? And they look up and they see a group of Ishmaelites who are coming. And they're in a caravan. The Bible actually says in verse 25 that they're coming with camels, and they're bringing spicery and balm and myrrh, and they're going to carry it down to Egypt. And in verse 26, for some reason, Judah, another one of Joseph's brothers, is still not convinced that he shouldn't be killing Joseph. And he says to the rest of his brothers, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. and his brethren were content. So he convinces everybody else that they're not going to kill him. They're going to instead sell him to the Ishmaelites into slavery in Egypt. So they come to this agreement, but in verse 28, it gets really weird, because instead of them pulling him out of the pit and selling him to the Ishmaelites like they planned on, look what happens in verse 28. Then they're passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. Okay, this is weird. His brothers were going to sell him to the Ishmaelites, but for some reason, while that was going on, another group of traders comes along called the Midianites, and they sell Joseph to the same group of Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And in verse 29, we see Reuben, remember the older brother? He returns to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit. And Reuben rent his clothes. And he returned to his brethren and said, "The child is not, and I, whither shall I go?" So this story is getting all over the place. So Reuben convinced his brothers to put Joseph into the pit, and then they see the Ishmaelites, and Judah convinces his brothers to sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, but the Midianites pull him out and sell him to the Ishmaelites instead, and then Reuben comes back to the pit for some reason, even though he knew that they were already planning on selling Joseph into Egypt, and he can't find his brother. So what's actually going on here? Well, at the end of the day, Joseph is already gone, and so they go through a series of events to go ahead and make it look like a wild animal killed Joseph. And you know the story, they kill one of the baby goats, and they put the coat into the blood, and they bring it back to their father, who's so upset that his favorite son, Joseph, is gone, and he can tell for sure that an evil beast has torn Joseph piece from piece in the wilderness, and his favorite son is dead. And in verse 36, we find the final verse of this chapter. Now keep in mind, the Midianites pulled Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. But in verse 36 it says, "And the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's, and the captain of the guard." So somehow the Midianites now have Joseph back. What is going on? How can they sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, but then they have him back to sell him to Potiphar in Egypt into slavery? That doesn't make any sense. And to make matters worse, if we look a couple chapters ahead in the Bible, chapter 39 and verse 1, it says, "And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him off the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither." So the Bible can't make up its mind. Who is actually selling Joseph into Egypt? At this point, one thing is very clear. It was not his brothers, but there are two different groups, the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, and the Bible keeps flip-flopping back and forth on which one pulled him out of the pit, sold him, and then sold him into Egypt. These are very clearly different accounts and different people. But there are some Christians who try to look at this and say, oh, well, hold on. These just must be interchangeable terms to use for one group of people. The Ishmaelites and the Midianites, they both are descendants from different children of Abraham, and so they're probably just the same group, and it just must have been a colloquial term to be able to call them either one, Ishmaelites or Midianites. But that is not how the rest of the Bible reads. These are two distinct groups of people who are in different locations. You'll remember the story when Moses runs away from Egypt after he kills that Egyptian guard, and he goes to the land of Midian. It was an actual place, a city, and that's where he spends the next 40 years of his life and meets his wife. In other areas of the Bible, we find that the Midianites were very hostile to the nation of Israel. If we look in Judges chapter 6 and verse 8, we find the story of Gideon and the Midianites that they're doing battle with. But the Ishmaelites were different. They were nomads. They worked in trading. And we see them time and time again as a separate people group from the Midianites. Even though they're related, they come from a different area. So this theory does not hold water. These were not the same people, and these terms can't be used interchangeably here. Instead, this is yet another error that we find in the book of Genesis, and we've talked about many on this show. And that's not the only error in this story. In verse 21, we saw that Reuben was trying to convince his brothers not to kill Joseph, and he was successful in that, it says. But then later on, we see that Judah, for some reason, is still trying to convince them not to kill him and instead sell him into slavery. But Reuben had already convinced them verses before not to do that. So again, this story is just not adding up. I think another interesting one is when we look at the Ishmaelites, who were described in verse 25 with their camels, and they were bearing spicery, balm, and myrrh. I guess the question I have about this one is, how did they know what they were carrying on their way to Egypt? Because Joseph's brothers never met this group. Remember, they planned on meeting them. They were going to pull Joseph out of the pit and sell him to the Ishmaelites, but instead someone else got there first and sold him to those same Ishmaelites, and they went on their way to Egypt. So Joseph's brothers never actually interacted with this group. How did they know that they had spices and balm and myrrh? This is kind of a weird detail to throw in there for someone that they never met. And the last one we already talked about, which was verses 15 through 17, where Joseph goes to Shechem and meets a man who tells him, oh, your brothers aren't here, they went to Dothan, you have to go there to find them. And so he does. Again, that didn't add any value to the story, but it seems like they're trying to explain some details where stories might not have added up. So what's going on here? Because this text is supposed to be divinely inspired. A divine being inspired men to write these words. So why do we find all these errors and these contradictions and downright mistakes in the Bible? Mistakes and divine inspiration just seemingly can't go together. But there is another possibility. You may or may not know that there's a theory called the documentary theory for the book of Genesis. Basically, the theory says that Genesis is made up of 3 or 4 different accounts by different authors. And Genesis is a compilation of those 3 to 4 different narratives all brought together. So the stories are similar, but the details have gotten slightly different, and the tones of these stories are also very different. So this leads us to multiple accounts of the same story and very different details that start to look like contradictions. A few of these we've talked about on this show already. The first one is creation. We see man actually gets created in chapter 1, and then again man gets created in chapter 2. 2 different instances telling the same story with slightly different details. We see another one of these with Noah and the flood. When he's told the animals to bring onto the ark, he's told 2 different times in 2 different chapters how many animals to bring on the ark. And we did an entire episode about the wife-sister stories in Genesis, where there are 3 different accounts of someone pretending that their wife is actually their sister. It's the same story with eerily similar details. And of course the last one here with Joseph and the Ishmaelites and the Midianites. Who actually pulled him out of the pit? Who sold him the first time? Who sold him into Egypt? Who did Potiphar buy Joseph from? This story is all over the place, likely because they had to bring these details in from 3 to 4 different sources and try to make it all fit. But it just doesn't work. The details are too different, and we, the readers, are starting to notice these things for ourselves and say, hey, something's not adding up here. So let me ask you this question. What's more likely? That a divine being can't figure out how to tell a coherent story when inspiring men to write this down? Or that this is actually the account from multiple men who remembered the details differently as this story was passed down through generations, and it was compiled all together to try to make things work as best they possibly could? I think you know where I stand on this story, but I want to know what you think. Let me know down in the comments, how else can we explain away these seeming contradictions again found in the book of Genesis? That's all for today's episode. Again, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the channel, and we'd love it if you like and share this video with someone else who could benefit from continuing to study with us. This has been another episode of Faith in Question. We'll see you next time.